The bruises on Sarah Mitchell's throat spelled out a message in purple and blue. This was what happened when scholarship kids forgot their place. But what transpired 47 seconds later would shatter more than just Jason Reynolds' wrist. It would expose a decade-old conspiracy reaching into the highest levels of government. Everyone thought Sarah was just another quiet girl who kept her head down and her mouth shut. What they didn't know was that her silence wasn't weakness, it was preparation. The security footage captured everything: the chokehold, the break, the scream. But there was something else on that tape that would send 3 powerful adults to federal prison and make Sarah Mitchell the most dangerous student in Westbrook Academy's 250-year history. If you've ever felt powerless in the face of injustice, this story might change how you see your own strength. Sometimes the quietest voices carry the loudest truth. Tuesday morning, 8:42 a.m. Westbrook Academy buzzed with the privileged energy that only came from old money colliding with older traditions in hallways lined with Revolutionary War-era portraits and fresh donor plaques. The school had been educating the children of America's elite since 1773, a fact reminded by the Patriots and President's banner hanging over the main entrance. Sarah Mitchell moved through the crowded marble corridor like smoke invisible unnoticed, exactly how she'd survived nearly 3 years at New England's most elite preparatory school. Her backpack faded, and practical stood out among designer bags like a battlefield medic in a fashion show. But Sarah had learned that being overlooked was a superpower, a lesson her father had taught her before his final deployment. What nobody knew, not her teachers, not her classmates, not even her mother working her 3rd consecutive shift at the VA hospital, was that Sarah Mitchell had been preparing for war since she was 11 years old. 6 years of Krav Maga training every Tuesday and Thursday at 5:30 a.m. at Nakamura's downtown gym. 6 years of learning that violence was never the first option, but when cornered, it needed to be devastatingly effective. Her father, Master Sergeant James Mitchell, had died in a peacekeeping operation when she was 10. His final letter contained just 4 words that would reshape her entire existence: "Eagles soar, but watch." Master Nakamura had taken her under his wing after reading that letter. The 70-year-old Japanese-American veteran had fought alongside her father in a jungle half a world away during a war most Americans wanted to forget. Now he taught her not just how to fight, but when to fight, and more importantly, how to document everything. "Justice needs evidence," he'd told her during their first session. "Your father knew that better than most." Sarah had been documenting everything for 3 years at Westbrook. Every slur, every shove, every accidental spill on her homework, all captured on the series of burner phones Master Nakamura had taught her to use stored on encrypted drives even the NSA would struggle to crack. Jason Reynolds strode through those same hallways like he owned them, because in many ways he did. 6 feet 2 inches of quarterback confidence wrapped in a Letterman jacket that cost more than most family sedans. His father, Senator William Reynolds, had donated the new technology wing. His mother chaired the board of trustees. Jason was Westbrook Academy royalty, and he never let anyone forget it. But beneath the golden boy exterior, Jason Reynolds was drowning. His father's expectations crushed down on him like a physical weight. Every practice, every game, every grade scrutinized and found wanting. At home, disappointment came with bruises hidden beneath expensive clothes. At school, Jason found release by making others feel as powerless as his father made him feel. The target rotation was systematic scholarship kids, foreign students, anyone different, anyone who dared to excel without proper breeding. This week, it was Lin Wang's turn. Sarah found Lin at the bottom of the main staircase, her textbooks scattered like broken dreams across the polished marble floor. Blood trickled from her split lip. Her advanced physics notebooks filled with equations that would have impressed NASA lay soaked in coffee that definitely hadn't been hers. 3 students walked past without helping. 2 more took photos for their Instagram stories. This was Westbrook Academy culture. See nothing. Say nothing. Survival of the wealthiest. "Are you hurt?" Sarah knelt beside Lynn, her voice barely above a whisper. "Just my pride." Lynn tried to laugh, but it came out cracked. Jason Reynolds and his crew thought my presentation on quantum entanglement was too show-offy for someone like me. Someone like me. The phrase hit Sarah like a physical blow. Asian, female, brilliant, and therefore threatening to boys who'd been told since birth that intellectual superiority was their birthright alongside political power. Sarah helped gather the scattered papers, noting how Lynn's brilliant equations were now stained with deliberate cruelty. "The cameras," Sarah said quietly, nodding toward the corner security device. "They'll have recorded this." Lynn's laugh was bitter. "You think Headmaster Sullivan cares about camera footage when the Reynolds family just pledged $10 million for the new Congressional Studies program? $10 million. Enough to buy silence, to rewrite history, to make assault look like accident, to ensure Lin Wang's broken lip would never appear in any official report." As Sarah helped Lin to her feet, something shifted in her carefully maintained invisibility for just a moment. Her movements became fluid, controlled, the kind of muscle memory that came from 6 years of training, 4 days a week, at 5:30 a.m. Lin's eyes widened. "Sarah, where did you learn to move like that?" "Move like what?" But Sarah's cover was blown. Someone had seen through her mask of helplessness. By lunch period, Matthew Carter had heard about the incident. As Jason's best friend since childhood, Matthew lived in the shadow of inherited violence. His father, Colonel Carter, now retired, had raised him on military discipline and character-building exercises that bordered on cruelty. Matthew found his identity by proxy being dangerous because Jason was dangerous, being feared because Jason was feared. But lately, watching Jason escalate from verbal harassment to physical assault made Matthew's stomach turn in ways he couldn't explain. "Did you see that scholarship girl help the Chinese chick?" Jason's voice carried across the cafeteria like a challenge. "Sarah Mitchell thinks she's some kind of hero." "Maybe we should leave her alone," Matthew suggested quietly. "She's never bothered anyone." "That's exactly the problem." Jason's eyes had gone cold the way they did right before someone got hurt. "She thinks she can ignore the social order, thinks being invisible makes her untouchable." Tyler Wilson. Their third musketeer looked up from his phone. "Dude, check this out." He showed them a video of Sarah helping Lynn, slowed down and analyzed. "Look how she moves. That's not normal girl stuff." Jason studied the footage with the intensity he usually reserved for game tape. Sarah's positioning her balance the way she'd instinctively scanned for threats while helping Lynn. It all suggested training, real training. "Interesting," Jason murmured. "Time to find out what our little mouse is hiding." The first test came during 4th period American history. Sarah sat in her usual back corner spot, taking notes with the mechanical precision that had kept her scholarship intact despite the social warfare around her. She'd learned to become furniture present, but unnoticed, essential but invisible. "Miss Mitchell," Professor Collins's voice cut through the routine, "would you share your perspective on the domestic impact of the Vietnam War?" Sarah moved to the center of classroom attention, her movements careful and controlled. Professor Eleanor Collins watched with sharp eyes The former war correspondent had seen enough combat zones to recognize when someone was operating with tactical awareness. As Sarah began her measured response about the war's impact on American families, something shifted in the room's energy. Her quiet competence, her obvious intelligence, her refusal to shrink herself to make others comfortable, it all painted a target on her back that grew larger with each articulate sentence. Jason watched from his front row seat with predatory interest. When Sarah finished her perfect analysis to scattered applause, he raised his hand with mockingly enthusiastic energy. "Great job, scholarship, girl! Really showed us how smart poor people can be when they try hard enough." The classroom fell silent. Professor Collins's face flushed with anger, but she said nothing, couldn't say anything. The Reynolds family's influence reached every corner of Westbrook Academy, and teachers who challenged their children found themselves seeking employment elsewhere. Sarah returned to her seat without responding. But Matthew noticed something others missed. Her hands remained perfectly steady, controlled. The hands of someone who'd been trained to stay calm under pressure. He also noticed something else. Sarah wasn't taking notes about the Vietnam War. She was writing detailed observations about Jason's behavior, time-stamped and precise. After class, Sarah's documentation ritual continued. She photographed her locker vandalized with crude drawings and the word "charity case" scrawled in permanent marker. She recorded audio of the whispered threats in the hallway. Scholarship kids should know their place. She compiled it all in a hidden folder organized by date and perpetrator. Master Nakamura had taught her well. A warrior without evidence is just another victim. The downtown gym where Sarah trained looked like it had been transported directly from 1975 and never updated. Faded posters of Bruce Lee and Muhammad Ali hung on walls painted institutional green decades ago. The smell of sweat and determination permeated everything. Master Robert Nakamura stood in the center of the training mat, his 70-year-old frame still straight as a Marine at attention. The scars on his forearms told stories of jungle warfare and street fights that his mouth never would. "You're favoring your right side again," he observed as Sarah completed her 40th push-up. "An observant opponent will exploit that weakness." "Yes, Sensei," Sarah corrected her form immediately. When she finished her warm-up routine, Nakamura motioned her to the worn wooden bench against the wall. Above it hung the only personal photograph in the entire gym, two young men in jungle fatigue's arms around each other's shoulders standing before a helicopter. One Asian, one Caucasian. Both wearing the 1,000-yard stare of men who had seen too much. "Your father would have been proud of you today," Nakamura said quietly. Sarah looked up in surprise. "You know about what happened at school." "I know everything that happens at that school." Nakamura's face remained impassive. "Just as I know the Reynolds boy has escalated his behavior from verbal to physical intimidation." Sarah's eyes narrowed. "How do you—" "I have my sources," Nakamura interrupted, "just as your father did." For the first time, Nakamura reached into his desk and removed a worn leather folder she had never seen before. From it, he extracted an ID card that made Sarah's breath catch. Federal Bureau of Investigation. Special Agent Robert Nakamura. The photo showed a younger version of her mentor, but with the same uncompromising eyes. "My service to this country didn't end in Vietnam," Nakamura said simply. "Neither did your father's. We were recruited for specialized work after our return." "You were FBI dad too." Sarah struggled to process this revelation. "Your father remained military intelligence. I joined the Bureau's Special Investigations Unit tracking domestic corruption." Nakamura carefully returned the ID to its hiding place. "We maintained our connection throughout the years, sharing information when our investigations overlapped. He looked at Sarah with new intensity. The Reynolds family has been on our radar for over 30 years. Senator William Reynolds's corruption extends far beyond typical political graft. He's buried evidence of war crimes profited from defense contracts, awarded through blackmail and silenced whistleblowers with extreme prejudice. Sarah felt the floor shifting beneath her. What does this have to do with me? Your father was investigating classified material related to Reynolds's activities in Southeast Asia when he was killed. Nakamura's voice remained steady, but his eyes revealed deep pain. His death was no accident. The world seemed to stop. Are you saying? I'm saying that the documentation you've been collecting isn't just about high school bullying. It's about establishing patterns of behavior that span generations. The son becomes the father. Nakamura stood his movement betraying none of his age. I've taught you Krav Maga to protect yourself. I've taught you documentation to protect others. Now it's time to teach you your father's most important skill, strategic patience. Sarah found her voice again. You've been preparing me to take down Jason's father. No. Nakamura's correction was gentle but firm. I've been preparing you to finish your father's work, exposing corruption that has cost American lives for decades. Jason Reynolds is merely the weak link in a corrupt chain that stretches back to Vietnam. He handed her a small flash drive. This contains some of what your father discovered. Study it, memorize it, then destroy it. Knowledge is the most powerful weapon I can give you. As Sarah left the gym that evening, the weight of her backpack felt insignificant compared to the burden of truth she now carried. The escalation came faster than even Sarah had anticipated. By Friday afternoon, Jason's patience with subtle intimidation had evaporated entirely. The final straw was Sarah's perfect score on the Advanced Placement U.S. government exam, a score that knocked Jason from valedictorian position and threatened his guaranteed Harvard admission. Emergency meeting, Jason texted his crew. Time to remind everyone how things work around here. Sarah was leaving her after-school tutoring session, helping underclassmen with calculus for $15 an hour, when she found them waiting by the east entrance. Jason, Matthew, and Tyler formed a triangle of expensive malice, their positioning calculated to cut off escape routes. Going somewhere charity case, Jason's voice had shed all pretense of civility. Home, Sarah replied, evenly calculating distances and angles out of habit. 3 opponents, all larger, all angry, but anger made people sloppy, and Sarah had learned to use every advantage. Not yet. Jason stepped closer, invading her personal space with deliberate aggression. We need to have a conversation about respect. I respect everyone until they give me reason not to. Sarah's voice remained calm, but her stance had shifted almost imperceptibly, weight balanced, ready to move. Matthew noticed the change immediately. Something about Sarah's positioning reminded him of documentaries he'd watched with his father. The moment before, a cornered animal revealed it had claws. "Shut up, Matthew," Jason snapped when his friend tried to intervene. His attention focused entirely on Sarah. "You think you're better than us because you have perfect grades. Think your scholarship makes you special. I think education is a privilege, not a right to abuse others." The words hung in the air like a declaration of war. Jason's face flushed red, all the rage he couldn't direct at his father finding a new target. "You want to see abuse? Let me show you what happens to mouthy scholarship kids." He reached for Sarah's throat with both hands, the same move his father had used on him countless times during their character-building sessions. But Sarah Mitchell wasn't Senator Reynolds, and she'd been trained by someone who understood that in a real fight there were no rules except survival. Time slowed as Jason's hands moved toward her neck. Sarah's training kicked in with mechanical precision. 6 years of muscle memory compressed into 3 seconds of devastating effectiveness. She stepped inside his reach, her left hand catching his right wrist in a grip that would have made Master Nakamura proud. Her right hand struck his elbow joint, with surgical accuracy hyperextending it just enough to break his grip without causing permanent damage. Jason stumbled backward, clutching his arm and staring at Sarah with shock and growing rage. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life," he hissed. "No," Sarah said quietly, her breathing still controlled despite the adrenaline flooding her system. "You did." What none of them realized was that Matthew had his phone out recording everything with shaking hands. He'd meant to capture Sarah's humiliation for Jason's entertainment. Instead, he documented something that made his stomach drop. Sarah Mitchell wasn't a victim. She was something far more dangerous. She was prepared. "Delete that video," Jason snarled at Matthew, but his friend seemed frozen, staring at Sarah with a mixture of fear and fascination. "I don't think so," Sarah said, her voice still maddeningly calm. "Matthew just documented attempted assault and battery. I defended myself with minimal force. That video might be the most important thing he's ever recorded." Jason looked between Sarah and Matthew, his golden boy confidence cracking for the first time in his life. "This isn't over." "Yes, it is." Sarah picked up her backpack, movements controlled and deliberate. "Unless you want to explain to the senator why you're facing assault charges, I imagine he has strong opinions about anything that might affect your Harvard acceptance." She walked away without looking back, leaving 3 boys to process what had just happened. The quiet scholarship girl had not only defended herself, she'd done it with a level of skill that suggested serious training. More terrifyingly, she'd done it while maintaining complete emotional control. Matthew stared at his phone screen, watching the footage replay. Sarah's defensive movement had been textbook perfect, efficient, controlled, designed to neutralize the threat without causing unnecessary harm. This wasn't luck or desperation. This was someone who'd been trained to fight. "Send me that video," Jason demanded, reaching for the phone, but Matthew was already backing up the file to multiple cloud accounts. Something told him this footage would be important later. "Jason," Matthew said quietly, "maybe we should leave her alone." "Are you insane?" Jason's voice cracked with rage and humiliation. "She just assaulted me in front of witnesses. She's done. Finished. I'll make sure she never shows her face in this school again." But even as Jason planned his revenge, Matthew couldn't shake the image of Sarah's eyes during the confrontation. They hadn't shown fear or anger. They'd shown something far more disturbing. They'd shown pity. Monday morning brought new intelligence that changed everything. Tyler Wilson had spent the weekend digging into Sarah Mitchell's background, looking for leverage to use against her. What he found made all 3 boys reconsider their understanding of their target. Her father was Special Forces, Tyler reported during their morning meeting in the empty weight room. "Died in a classified operation, Silver Star recipient." He paused for dramatic effect. "But here's the interesting part. Sarah's been training at Nakamura's gym downtown for 6 years, Krav Maga 4 times a week." Jason's blood ran cold. Krav Maga wasn't a hobby. It was a military combat system designed for close-quarters engagement against multiple opponents. If Sarah had been training since she was 11, she was essentially a weapon disguised as a scholarship student. "That explains Friday," Matthew muttered, remembering the effortless way Sarah had neutralized Jason's attack. "No, it doesn't explain anything," Jason snapped, but his bravado sounded hollow even to himself. "It means she's been planning this, pretending to be weak while learning how to fight. She's been playing us." The truth was more complex than Jason's paranoid imagination could grasp. Sarah hadn't been planning for 3 years to fight him specifically. She'd been planning for 3 years to survive Westbrook Academy. Every slight, every humiliation, every moment of deliberate exclusion had been documented and catalogued, not for revenge, but for justice. Because Sarah Mitchell had learned something that her privileged classmates never had to consider when the system is designed to protect bullies: you have to become your own protection. Professor Collins found Sarah during lunch period grading papers in the empty library with mechanical precision. As Westbrook Academy's only openly progressive faculty member, Eleanor Collins understood what it meant to navigate hostile territory while maintaining perfect composure. "The incident on Friday," she said without preamble, settling into the chair across from Sarah. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," Sarah's standard response delivered with practiced neutrality. "I saw the video Matthew Carter posted before he deleted it." Professor Collins's voice dropped to a whisper. "That was impressive self-defense." Sarah's pen stopped moving. In 3 years at Westbrook Academy, no teacher had ever acknowledged the obvious pattern of harassment she endured. They all saw, but seeing and acting were different things entirely. "I defended myself with minimal force," Sarah said carefully. "You did more than that." Professor Collins pulled out her own phone, showing Sarah a screenshot. "You've been documenting everything. The harassment, the escalation, the final assault. You've been building a case." Sarah studied the older woman's face, searching for the trap. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I've been building a case, too." Professor Collins's admission hung between them like a shared secret. 3 years of incident reports that mysteriously disappear. 3 years of students transferring after disciplinary issues that were really retaliation for reporting abuse. 3 years of watching talented kids like you suffer in silence, because speaking up means losing everything. The alliance formed without words. 2 women united by their understanding of how power worked at Westbrook Academy. Professor Collins had been documenting from above, Sarah from below. Together, they had enough evidence to expose a system that protected predators and silenced victims. "What happens next?" Sarah asked. "That depends on how far Jason Reynolds is willing to escalate." Professor Collins's expression was grim. "His father's political campaign is struggling with whispers of corruption. The family needs Jason's Harvard acceptance to maintain their social standing. They can't afford any scandals. So they'll try to destroy me before I can expose them." "They'll try?" Professor Collins smiled, but it was the kind of smile predators recognized in prey that was no longer defenseless. "But they don't know what they're really dealing with." Sarah Mitchell, the quiet scholarship student who'd spent 3 years invisible in plain sight, was about to become the most dangerous person at Westbrook Academy. Not because she was violent, but because she was prepared. The countdown to destruction had begun, and Jason Reynolds had no idea he was about to lose everything to the girl he'd underestimated for 3 years. Wednesday afternoon, 3:45 p.m. Jason Reynolds made the decision that would destroy his life. Standing in Headmaster Sullivan's office, surrounded by Revolutionary War memorabilia and family portraits of notable alumni, he played his final card. "Sarah Mitchell assaulted me," he announced to Headmaster Sullivan and his father, who'd been summoned for an emergency meeting. "I want her expelled and arrested." Headmaster Sullivan, a thin man who'd spent 25 years perfecting the art of administrative cowardice, wrung his hands nervously. "Jason, are you sure about this? The girl has an exemplary academic record." "I don't care if she's Einstein's daughter." Senator William Reynolds's voice cut through the office like a combat knife. My son was assaulted by a scholarship student. This school's reputation depends on maintaining proper order. What none of them knew was that Sarah Mitchell was 3 floors below in the computer lab uploading 3 years of documented evidence to a secure server. Every threat, every incident, every moment of administrative failure, time-stamped and cross-referenced. Master Nakamura had taught her patience, but he'd also taught her preparation. Matthew Carter sat in the hallway outside the headmaster's office, his hands shaking as he stared at his phone. The original video of Friday's confrontation was still saved in his cloud storage. But Jason had demanded he delete all copies. Now, listening to the lies being told inside that office, Matthew faced the biggest decision of his 17-year-old life. He could stay loyal to Jason, his best friend since childhood, and watch Sarah Mitchell be destroyed for defending herself. Or he could do something that terrified him more than Jason's anger. He could tell the truth. Matthew opened his phone and began typing a message that would change everything. Professor Collins, I have video evidence of what really happened Friday. Can we meet? Inside the headmaster's office, Senator Reynolds was outlining his expectations with military precision. I want the girl expelled today. I want her arrested for assault. And I want it made clear to every scholarship student in this school that this is what happens when they forget their place. Senator Reynolds, Headmaster Sullivan ventured carefully, perhaps we should investigate. Investigate what? Reynolds's voice rose dangerously. My son has injuries. He has witnesses. End of investigation. But Jason Reynolds's injuries were from a football practice after the incident with Sarah, and his witnesses were either lying or coerced. The truth was something far more dangerous to the Reynolds family's carefully constructed image. Their golden boy had been outmatched by a girl 1/3 his size. Sarah Mitchell finished uploading her evidence at exactly 4:15 p.m. 3 years of systematic harassment, documented with the precision Master Nakamura had drilled into her. Every photo timestamp verified, every audio recording enhanced for clarity, every witness statement cross-referenced. As she closed her laptop, Sarah's phone buzzed with a message from Professor Collins. They're convening an emergency disciplinary hearing tonight. 7:00 p.m. Board members will be present. This is not standard protocol. For the first time in 3 years at Westbrook Academy, Sarah Mitchell smiled. The quiet girl who'd survived by staying invisible was about to step into the light. And when she did, the entire power structure of Westbrook Academy would burn. The war for truth was about to begin, and Sarah Mitchell held all the weapons. 4:30 p.m., and Matthew Carter stood outside Professor Collins's classroom with evidence that would detonate Jason Reynolds's world like a nuclear bomb. His hands trembled as he knocked 3 years of friendship warring against a conscience that refused to stay buried. Matthew. Professor Collins opened the door, her expression carefully neutral. I got your message. I need to show you something before they destroy Sarah for defending herself. The video played on Professor Collins's computer screen with devastating clarity. Jason's unprovoked aggression, his attempt to grab Sarah's throat, her precisely controlled defensive response. But more damning was the audio, Jason's voice clearly stating his intention to teach the scholarship kid respect. This happened Friday, Professor Collins asked, though she already knew the answer. Yes, ma'am. And there's more. Matthew pulled out a second phone, his personal device that Jason didn't know about. I've been recording his behavior for months. The threats, the violence, everything. I was too scared to do anything but watching him lie to Headmaster Sullivan today. He trailed off, shame coloring his voice. Professor Collins studied the young man before her. Matthew Carter had spent 3 years as Jason's shadow complicit in countless acts of cruelty through his silence. But conscience, she'd learned, had its own timeline. "Why now, Matthew? Why are you coming forward?" "Because Sarah was right." Matthew's voice strengthened. Friday, when Jason tried to grab her, she looked at him with pity, not fear, not anger. Pity, like she understood something about him that he didn't understand about himself. The insight was more profound than Matthew realized. Sarah had recognized in Jason the same cycle of abuse that had destroyed so many before him. Powerful men creating powerless victims who became powerful abusers themselves. Breaking that cycle required someone willing to stand up regardless of the cost. "There's something else," Matthew continued. "Jason's planning something for tonight. He got Headmaster Sullivan to schedule an emergency disciplinary hearing at 7:00 p.m. His father will be there along with board members. They're going to expel Sarah without giving her a chance to defend herself." Professor Collins's blood ran cold. "That's illegal. Students have due process rights. Not scholarship students whose accusations threaten million-dollar donations." The corruption was deeper than even Professor Collins had suspected. Westbrook Academy operated under two sets of rules, one for the legacy families who funded the school, another for everyone else. But what Senator Reynolds didn't know was that his son had just handed their enemies the ammunition needed to destroy everything they'd built. Sarah Mitchell received the emergency summons at 5:15 p.m. The formal language couldn't disguise the ambush being prepared. Disciplinary hearing regarding serious allegations of student misconduct. No specifics. No opportunity to prepare a defense. No mention of her right to representation. "They're moving fast," she texted Professor Collins. "We're ready," came the immediate reply. "Matthew Carter has provided additional evidence. Meet me in classroom 214 at 6:30. Time to end this." Classroom 214, the same room where Jason had planned his final assault. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah as she gathered her materials. 3 years of documentation, witness statements, and now video evidence of Jason's assault. Master Nakamura had taught her that victory belonged to those who prepared most thoroughly. At 6:15 p.m., she made a final call from the privacy of an empty stairwell. "Sensei, it's happening tonight." Master Nakamura's voice remained calm. "Are you prepared?" "Yes, but there's something I don't understand. Why did you train me all these years if you knew what happened to my father? Why not go after Reynolds yourself?" The silence stretched for several seconds before Nakamura answered. "Because some battles can only be won by the next generation. Your father believed that. So do I." A rare emotion colored his voice. "I'll be there tonight. You won't see me, but I'll be watching." Sarah ended the call with new determination. This wasn't just about her survival at Westbrook Academy. This was about completing her father's mission, exposing corruption that had festered for decades. At 6:45 p.m., Sarah entered the administrative conference room to find a tribunal designed to intimidate. Headmaster Sullivan sat at the head of a mahogany table that cost more than her mother's annual salary. Senator Reynolds loomed behind his son like a malevolent shadow. 5 board members, all major donors, occupied seats along the sides. Only 2 people seemed out of place. Professor Collins sitting quietly in the corner with a laptop bag, and an expression that suggested she'd been waiting for this moment for years. And surprisingly, Matthew Carter looking pale but determined as he took a seat near the door. "Miss Mitchell," Headmaster Sullivan began, his voice quavering with nervous authority. "You've been accused of assaulting a fellow student. This is a serious matter that could result in expulsion and criminal charges." I defended myself against an unprovoked attack, Sarah replied evenly. I have evidence supporting that fact. Evidence? Senator Reynolds's laugh was ugly. Young lady, you assaulted my son. 3 witnesses confirm it. Your scholarship is terminated effective immediately. Actually, Professor Collins stood smoothly. We have video evidence that tells a different story. The room erupted. Board members shouted objections. Senator Reynolds threatened lawsuits. Headmaster Sullivan demanded to know how a teacher had obtained such material. Through it all, Sarah remained silent, watching the panic spread like infection among people who'd never faced real accountability. Matthew Carter stood his movement, drawing every eye in the room. I recorded everything, he announced, his voice cutting through the chaos. Jason's assault on Sarah, his threats against other students. Senator Reynolds turned on Matthew with venomous fury. You little traitor! Your father will hear about this. My father taught me that courage means doing what's right, even when it's hard, Matthew replied, opening his laptop. And what Jason did wasn't right. The first video played in devastating silence. Jason's unprovoked aggression, his attempt to grab Sarah's throat, her controlled defensive response. But the audio was what destroyed him, his voice clearly stating his intention to assault a fellow student because of her socio-economic status. This was Friday afternoon, Matthew explained to the stunned room. What you're about to see is what happened this morning when Jason realized I still had the video. The second recording began playing Jason's voice, echoing through the empty locker room. You think recording me makes you smart? I'll make sure your military school applications all get rejected. Your dad will love that, won't he? On screen, Jason shoved Matthew against a locker, his face contorted with rage. Delete every copy, or I'll tell everyone what really happened at summer camp last year. The board members watched in horrified silence as Jason Reynolds transformed from golden boy to abuser before their eyes. The pattern of behavior was unmistakable. The same intimidation tactics, the same threats, the same entitlement that had characterized his father's political career. There's more, Professor Collins said quietly. She connected her own laptop to the room's projection system, displaying a comprehensive file system. 3 years of documented harassment, administrative cover-ups, and systematic discrimination against scholarship students. The evidence was overwhelming: audio recordings of threats, photographs of vandalized property, witness statements from terrified students, and documentation of administrative inaction. Each piece individually damning, collectively devastating. You can't prove any systemic wrongdoing, Senator Reynolds blustered, but his voice lacked conviction. Actually, we can. Sarah spoke for the first time, her voice steady. She opened her own laptop, displaying a different set of files. These are reports my father filed with military intelligence before his death. Reports about certain activities in Southeast Asia during and after the Vietnam War. Reports that implicate you directly in the cover-up of war crimes and profiteering from defense contracts. The senator's face went ashen. Those records are classified. Where did you— My father made copies. He knew what might happen to him. Sarah's eyes never left the senator's face. He taught me that eagles soar, but they also watch. I've been watching you for 3 years, just like he watched you for 20. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. This wasn't just about one assault in a high school hallway. It was about a systematic pattern of abuse protected by money and enabled by cowardice, a pattern that stretched back decades. Sarah Mitchell stood up her movement, drawing every eye in the room. For 3 years, she'd been invisible, the quiet scholarship girl who absorbed abuse without complaint. Now she commanded attention with the quiet authority of someone who'd survived everything they could throw at her. "You want to know why I documented everything?" Her voice carried the weight of accumulated injustice. "Because my father died fighting for freedom, and I watched you use his sacrifice to justify oppression. Because Maria Rodriguez tried to kill herself last year after your son's systematic harassment, and you covered it up. Because Lin Wang lives in fear every day, and you call it character building." She turned to face Jason Reynolds directly. "I didn't want to hurt you. I wanted you to stop hurting others, but you made violence the only language you'd understand." Jason looked up at her through tears of pain and humiliation. "My father will destroy you for this. Your father can't even save himself now." The room's attention shifted to the doorway, where an elderly Japanese-American man stood with perfect military posture. Behind him were two men in dark suits, their government IDs visible on their lapels. "Master Nakamura," Sarah whispered. Robert Nakamura stepped into the room with the quiet confidence of a man who had faced worse threats than angry politicians. "Senator Reynolds, these agents from the Inspector General's office would like to discuss certain financial irregularities related to defense appropriations under your committee's oversight." Senator Reynolds's face collapsed into a mask of desperate calculation. "This is a school matter. You have no jurisdiction here." "On the contrary," one of the agents replied. "Evidence of financial crimes was discovered during this investigation. That makes it very much our jurisdiction." As Senator Reynolds was escorted from the room protesting loudly about his connections and political immunity, Sarah caught Master Nakamura's eye. The slight nod he gave her contained a world of meaning. Mission accomplished, soldier. The Westbrook Academy board members sat in stunned silence, watching as decades of careful power arrangements collapsed in minutes. Headmaster Sullivan's career was effectively over. The Reynolds family's influence shattered beyond repair. And through it all, Sarah Mitchell remained standing, the quiet girl whose documentation had brought down a corrupt empire. "The disciplinary hearing is adjourned," Professor Collins announced to the shell-shocked room, "and I believe the board has some serious policy revisions to consider regarding student safety and administrative accountability." As the impromptu tribunal disbanded in disarray, Matthew approached Sarah hesitantly. "I'm sorry for everything." "You came through when it mattered," Sarah replied, her voice softening for the first time. "That's what counts." Outside in the darkened parking lot, Sarah found Master Nakamura waiting beside his ancient Jeep, the same model he'd driven in Vietnam all those years ago. "My father would be proud," Sarah said quietly. "Of both of us." Nakamura nodded. "His mission is complete." "Not quite." Sarah looked back at the imposing silhouette of Westbrook Academy, its colonial architecture a reminder of power structures built on exclusion and privilege. "This was just one battle in a much longer war. And you'll be ready for the next one," Nakamura replied with certainty. "Just as your father would have been." As they drove away, Sarah Mitchell looked out at the passing New England landscape, the same hills and forests where American revolutionaries had once fought against tyranny. Her father had continued that fight in jungles halfway across the world. Now she carried their shared legacy forward. The quiet observer had found her voice, and the world would never be the same. The next morning, Westbrook Academy hummed with the electric current of rumor and speculation. Sarah Mitchell's name whispered through hallways like a revolutionary code, the scholarship girl who had brought down the mighty Reynolds family. The story grew with each retelling. She was a secret military operative. She had blackmailed the board. She had connections to federal intelligence. None of them knew how close to the truth their wild theories came. Sarah moved through the same hallways differently now, no longer invisible, but not quite comfortable with visibility either. 6 years of training had prepared her for physical confrontation. Nothing had prepared her for notoriety. The morning news carried the first public reports: Senator William Reynolds steps down from Armed Services Committee amid investigation. No mention of a high school disciplinary hearing or a scholarship student named Sarah Mitchell. The machinery of power was already working to contain the damage to separate the senator's disgrace from its unlikely catalyst. Professor Collins intercepted Sarah outside her first period class, steering her into an empty classroom with gentle urgency. "The board is in emergency session," she said without preamble. "They're debating how to handle this without bringing further embarrassment to the school." "And without admitting their complicity," Sarah added, her voice calm despite the storm around her. "Precisely." Professor Collins's smile was thin. "They're already constructing a narrative that paints the Reynolds family as unfortunate outliers in an otherwise spotless institution. What happens now? That depends on what you want to happen." Professor Collins studied her carefully. "You have leverage, Sarah. For perhaps the first time in Westbrook's history, a scholarship student holds power over the board." Sarah considered this. Master Nakamura had taught her that true victory wasn't about defeating an enemy, it was about changing the conditions that created enemies in the first place. "I want systemic change," she said finally. "New anti-harassment policies with real enforcement. An independent student advocate position with actual authority. And a full scholarship fund for students from military families who've lost parents in service." Professor Collins's eyebrows rose slightly. "You've given this some thought." 3 years' worth. Sarah's smile was brief but genuine. "I've had plenty of time to consider what justice looks like." As they parted ways, Sarah caught sight of Matthew Carter watching her from across the hallway. The guilt in his eyes was palpable, 3 years of complicity weighing on him like physical gravity. She gave him a small nod, not forgiveness exactly, but acknowledgement of his choice when it had truly mattered. Her phone buzzed with a text from Master Nakamura. "News coverage beginning. Prepare accordingly." The media descended on Westbrook Academy. By noon, satellite trucks parked along the stately drive, reporters stationed at the wrought iron gates, drones hovering over the Revolutionary War-era campus. The story was irresistible, privileged corruption exposed at America's most elite preparatory school, with hints of government malfeasance stretching back decades. Headmaster Sullivan released a carefully worded statement. "Westbrook Academy is cooperating fully with authorities regarding allegations concerning former board member Senator William Reynolds. The integrity of our institution and the well-being of our students remain our highest priorities." No mention of Sarah Mitchell. No mention of 3 years of documented harassment. No mention of administrative cover-ups. The narrative was being sanitized in real time. Sarah watched the coverage from the quiet sanctuary of the library's 3rd floor, her laptop open to multiple news sites. She knew her anonymity was temporary in the digital age. No catalyst remained unnamed for long. Master Nakamura had prepared her for this moment as well. "When the spotlight finds you," he'd told her, "remember that visibility is both vulnerability and power. How you use it determines which it becomes." A shadow fell across her table. Matthew Carter stood awkwardly holding his backpack like a shield. "May I sit down?" His voice was uncertain, the confident swagger of Jason Reynolds's lieutenant, replaced by the hesitancy of someone navigating unfamiliar moral territory. Sarah gestured to the empty chair across from her. 3 years of invisibility had taught her to observe before judging. "They're saying Jason's been withdrawn from school," Matthew said after a moment of uncomfortable silence. His parents have sent him to some private facility in Switzerland while they manage the situation. And Senator Reynolds, under investigation. They seized computers from his office this morning. Matthew's eyes finally met hers. My father called me, said I should be prepared for questions from federal investigators. The unspoken question hung between them: how deep did this go? How many people would be caught in the widening gyre of the Reynolds family's fall? Tell them the truth, Sarah said simply. Everything you saw, everything you heard, everything you did and didn't do. Matthew flinched at the implicit indictment. I should have stopped him sooner. Yes, you should have. Sarah's voice contained no accusation, only quiet certainty. But you can't change that now. You can only decide what you do next. The conversation was interrupted by Sarah's phone buzzing with an incoming call, her mother's ringtone. Sarah excused herself, moving to the window alcove for privacy. Mom, what's wrong? Marie Mitchell's voice trembled with anxiety. There are reporters at the hospital, Sarah. They're asking about your father, about you. What's happening? Sarah closed her eyes briefly. The spotlight had found her family faster than expected. I'll explain everything tonight, she promised. Don't talk to anyone. Don't answer any questions. I'll be home early. As she ended the call, Sarah felt the weight of responsibility settling more heavily on her shoulders. Her actions had consequences beyond Westbrook Academy's manicured grounds, consequences that now reached her exhausted mother working double shifts at the VA hospital. Matthew was still waiting when she returned to the table. Problems? He asked. Complications, Sarah corrected. This was never going to stay contained within school walls. Matthew nodded slowly. Jason always said his father had ways of making problems disappear. I never really understood what he meant, until now. What else did Jason say about his father? Sarah's question was casual, but her attention sharpened. Matthew considered for a moment. He talked sometimes about a place in Vietnam, some kind of camp or base, said his father kept a locked room at home with stuff from their medals, photos, documents, called it his war room. Jason was never allowed inside, but he snuck in once when his parents were away. Did he say what he saw? Just that there were maps with locations marked, photos of men in uniform, and a wooden box with names carved into it. Matthew frowned, trying to recall details. He said it creeped him out, like his father was obsessed with something that happened there. Sarah's mind raced, connecting this new information with fragments from her father's files. A camp in Vietnam, locations on maps, names carved in memorial. Did Jason ever mention a place called Firebase Lonesome? She asked suddenly. Matthew's eyes widened in surprise. How did you know that's what was written on some of the maps? Jason thought it was a weird name. Firebase Lonesome. The same outpost mentioned in her father's redacted reports. The same location that had appeared in Master Nakamura's files. The pieces were beginning to align with terrible clarity. The small apartment Sarah shared with her mother felt especially cramped that evening, filled with the unspoken weight of revelations and their consequences. Marie Mitchell sat at their scratched kitchen table, still wearing her hospital scrubs, her face lined with exhaustion and concern. I saw the news, she said quietly, as Sarah prepared a simple dinner of pasta and sauce. Senator Reynolds, the investigation. They're saying it involves classified Vietnam War documents. Sarah placed 2 plates on the table, buying time as she considered how much to reveal. Dad's death wasn't an accident, she finally said. He was investigating corruption. Senator Reynolds was involved. Marie's hands trembled slightly as she reached for her water glass. Your father told me once that if anything happened to him, I should look in the lining of his old field jacket. I never did. I couldn't bear to disturb his things after—" She left the sentence unfinished, but Sarah understood. Grief had its own timeline, its own sacred boundaries. Where is the jacket now? In the storage locker. Box labeled James Personal. 30 minutes later, Sarah knelt on the concrete floor of a small storage unit, carefully examining the worn olive-drab field jacket that still carried faint traces of her father's aftershave. The lining had been expertly modified, a hidden pocket sewn with military precision along the inside seam. From it, she extracted a small flash drive sewn inside a protective leather pouch. Faded marker on the leather read simply, "Insurance." Back at the apartment, Sarah inserted the drive into her laptop. The files were encrypted, but her father had prepared for that as well. The password was the same phrase he'd left in his final letter, "Eagles soar but watch." The screen filled with documents, mission reports, surveillance photos, financial transactions, and a detailed timeline spanning from 1971 to 2015. At the center of it all was Firebase Lonesome and something called Operation Homeward. Sarah read with growing horror as the true nature of her father's investigation became clear. Firebase Lonesome hadn't been an ordinary military outpost. It had been the site of unauthorized medical experiments on both American soldiers and Vietnamese civilians' experiments funded by a pharmaceutical consortium with ties to William Reynolds's family company. When the war ended, the evidence was supposedly destroyed. But samples and data had been smuggled back to the United States, where the research continued in private facilities funded through classified defense contracts overseen by Reynolds's committee. The final entries in her father's files were dated just days before his death. He had traced shipments of experimental compounds to a research facility in Massachusetts less than 30 miles from Westbrook Academy. The facility's board of directors included 3 current Westbrook board members. The conspiracy wasn't just about one corrupt senator. It encompassed an entire network of powerful individuals who had profited from suffering for over 40 years. Sarah's phone rang, startling her. Master Nakamura's number. "Have you found it?" he asked without preamble. "Yes, my father's files on Firebase Lonesome and Operation Homeward." Sarah's voice was steady despite her racing heart. "Did you know about all of this?" "Parts of it. Your father discovered the connections to current research facilities. That's what made his investigation dangerous. He wasn't just exposing historical crimes. He was revealing ongoing operations." The Westbrook board members are involved, yes? The school has been a useful networking hub for decades, connecting military contracts with pharmaceutical research and political protection. Nakamura's voice hardened. "Your confrontation with Jason Reynolds threatened more than his Harvard acceptance. It threatened an entire system of power and profit." Sarah thought of the storage facility where she'd found her father's jacket, an anonymous building owned by a shell company. "They'll be looking for these files now, won't they?" "Yes, Senator Reynolds knows your father had evidence. That's why we need to move quickly." Master Nakamura's voice took on a new urgency. "Pack a bag, essential items only. I'll pick you up in 30 minutes. "What about my mother?" "Call Professor Collins. Ask her to stay with your mother tonight. Say nothing about the files." As Sarah ended the call, she felt the ground shifting beneath her again. The quiet battle she'd been fighting within Westbrook Academy's walls had suddenly expanded into something far more dangerous. A confrontation with powerful people who had already killed to protect their secrets. She was no longer just a scholarship student documenting harassment. She was her father's daughter, carrying forward his mission to expose corruption that had destroyed countless lives. And that made her a target. Master Nakamura's jeep followed back roads through the Massachusetts countryside, headlights cutting through darkness as they headed away from the city. Sarah sat in the passenger seat, her father's field jacket wrapped around her shoulders like armor. "Where are we going?" she asked after they'd been driving for nearly an hour. "Somewhere safe," Nakamura replied, his eyes scanning the road ahead. "Somewhere they won't think to look for you." The somewhere turned out to be a small cabin nestled in pine woods, its weathered exterior blending into the surrounding forest. It looked like a hunting retreat, the kind of place where veterans might gather to fish and reminisce about younger days. Inside, however, was a different story. The main room had been converted into an operations center, computers, communications equipment, and walls covered with maps and photographs. One entire section was dedicated to Firebase Lonesome, including a three-dimensional terrain model. "Welcome to Echo Base," Nakamura said, securing the door behind them. "Your father helped set this up years ago. Only 3 people know about it." "You, my father, and who else?" Sarah asked, taking in the impressive array of intelligence-gathering equipment. "Carl Woodward," Nakamura replied. "Former war correspondent. Now an investigative journalist with connections to several major publications. He's been tracking the Firebase Lonesome story for decades." As if summoned by his name, a tall, gaunt man with a shock of white hair emerged from a side room. Despite his age, mid-70s at least, he moved with the precise economy of someone used to navigating dangerous terrain. "You must be James Mitchell's daughter," he said, extending a hand. "You have his eyes, and apparently his talent for stirring up hornets' nests." Sarah shook his hand, noting the strength in his grip and the keen intelligence in his weathered face. "My father never mentioned you." "That was by design." Woodward's smile was brief but genuine. "Your father and I agreed that my role would be to publish the story if something happened to him. Insurance, he called it." "Why wait all these years?" Sarah couldn't keep the accusation from her voice. "My father died 7 years ago." "Because the evidence wasn't complete," Woodward replied without defensiveness. "We needed the connection to current operations proof that this wasn't just historical wrongdoing, but ongoing criminal activity. Your father was close to establishing that link when he was killed." "And now we have it," Nakamura interjected, gesturing to Sarah's laptop case. "James's final insurance policy." Sarah unpacked her computer and connected it to the larger system. Her father's files spread across multiple screens, a digital tapestry of corruption and cover-up spanning nearly 50 years. Firebase Lonesome was established in 1969 as a forward operating base near the Laotian border, Woodward explained as they examined the documents. On paper, it was a standard military installation. In reality, it was a testing site for experimental combat performance enhancers developed by Reynolds Pharmaceutical. "Performance enhancers?" Sarah questioned. "Drugs designed to create better soldiers, men who could fight longer, endure more pain, require less sleep." Nakamura's voice was grim. "I was deployed near there in '71. We heard rumors about a unit that never seemed to rest soldiers who would continue fighting despite serious injuries. The official record shows Firebase Lonesome was abandoned after a Viet Cong attack in 1972. Woodward continued, "All personnel lost, all records destroyed. A convenient narrative that allowed the Reynolds family to distance themselves from the program while preserving its research." "But someone survived," Sarah guessed, seeing where the story led. "3 men survived," Nakamura confirmed. 2 test subjects and 1 researcher. They smuggled out samples and data. After the war, William Reynolds, then a junior congressman on the Veterans Affairs Committee, arranged for the research to continue through classified defense contracts. Sarah thought of Jason Reynolds, his volatile rage, and his father's bruising discipline. The effects of these drugs were passed down genetically. Woodward finished for her. Increased aggression, reduced impulse control, heightened pain threshold. The perfect soldier in combat, but a disaster in civilian life. That's why Senator Reynolds was so obsessed with character building for his son, Nakamura added. He was trying to control the genetic legacy of Firebase Lonesome. Sarah scrolled through her father's files until she found personnel records from the secret facility. One photograph stopped her cold, a young medical officer with familiar features. "Is that Headmaster Sullivan?" Nakamura confirmed. Before he reinvented himself as an educator, he was a research physician at Firebase Lonesome, specializing in behavioral modification. The pieces clicked into terrible alignment. Westbrook Academy wasn't just a prestigious school, it was a monitoring station, a place where the children of Firebase Lonesome veterans could be observed, their behaviors documented, their genetic legacy tracked across generations. "This is bigger than one corrupt senator," Sarah said slowly. "This is about an entire generation of veterans and their families being used as unwitting test subjects." "Exactly," Woodward nodded approvingly. "That's the story your father was building, not just historical war crimes, but an ongoing conspiracy that has affected thousands of Americans for decades. And now we have the evidence to expose it." Nakamura added his voice, carrying the weight of 40 years' patience. Sarah thought of Matthew Carter, his father, the retired colonel, his own struggles with aggression and moral clarity. How many students at Westbrook are connected to this? At least 15 current students are descendants of Firebase Lonesome personnel, Woodward replied, including Matthew Carter. His father was one of the test subjects. The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. Matthew's erratic behavior, his conflicted loyalty, his moments of clarity, fighting against conditioned responses, all of it made terrible sense now. "Does Matthew know?" "No," Nakamura said quietly. "None of the children know. That's part of the experiment, observing genetic expression without subjects' awareness." Sarah felt sick. For 3 years, she'd been surrounded by victims who didn't know they were victims, children carrying the burden of a war they hadn't fought, genetic modifications they hadn't consented to. "We need to expose this," she said with sudden certainty. "Not just for my father, but for all of them. For Matthew. For Jason, even." Woodward and Nakamura exchanged glances, a silent communication between men who had seen too much war to believe in easy victories. "Publishing this story will shake the foundations of multiple institutions," Woodward cautioned. "The military, the medical establishment, the government. Powerful people will fight back." "They already killed my father," Sarah said simply. "What more can they take from me?" The answer came sooner than any of them expected, a sharp notification tone from one of the surveillance monitors. Nakamura moved quickly to the security system, checking cameras positioned around the property's perimeter. "We have visitors," he announced grimly. "2 vehicles approaching from the access road." Woodward moved to another monitor. "Federal plates. Either they're really FBI or someone wants us to think they are." "How did they find this place?" Sarah asked, already knowing the answer. "They followed you," Nakamura replied without accusation. "Or, more likely, they tracked your father's files when you accessed them. We should have anticipated that possibility." He moved with practiced efficiency, powering down systems, initiating data transfers to secure servers. "Woodward takes Sarah through the tunnel. I'll handle our visitors." "No," Sarah said firmly. "I'm not running. Not anymore." The 2 men stared at her in surprise. "My father spent years building this case," she continued. "He died because he was working alone, isolated. The only way to protect this information, to protect all of us, is to make it public, now." "We're not ready for full publication," Woodward protested. "The story needs corroboration, editorial review. We don't need full publication yet." Sarah was already typing on her laptop. "We just need enough information in the public domain that disappearing us won't solve the problem." She opened a secure file transfer protocol, uploading key documents to multiple destinations, news organizations, legal advocacy groups, veteran support networks. Not the full story, but enough to raise serious questions, enough to ensure that any action against them would only confirm the allegations. "Eagles soar, but watch," she murmured as the uploads completed. "My father wasn't just telling me to be observant. He was telling me to get high enough that everyone could see what was happening." The security monitors showed the vehicles parking at the edge of the clearing. 4 men in dark suits emerged, moving with the coordinated precision of military training. "Federal agents wouldn't approach like that," Nakamura observed. "These are private contractors, probably former special operations." "Reynolds Family Security," Woodward agreed. "They've used the same firm for decades." Sarah felt strangely calm as she completed the final uploads. Master Nakamura had taught her that fear was natural, but panic was a choice. She chose clarity instead. "They're not here to arrest us," she said, understanding flowing through her like cold water. "They're here to recover my father's files and eliminate witnesses, just like they did to him." Nakamura moved to a locked cabinet, extracting a weathered military footlocker. From it, he removed 3 handguns, offering one each to Woodward and Sarah. "I've never fired a gun," Sarah admitted, hesitating. "Then today is not the day to start." Nakamura decided, returning her weapon to the locker. Instead, he handed her a satellite phone. "If we're not out in 15 minutes, call the number programmed under Echo. Give them this location and the phrase, 'Lonesome Eagle, returning to nest.'" Before Sarah could protest, both men moved toward the cabin's entrance, weapons concealed but ready. "Stay in the communications room," Nakamura instructed. "The tunnel entrance is behind the map board if you need it." Then they were gone, leaving Sarah alone with humming equipment and the terrible knowledge that history was repeating itself, men who had survived one war heading out to fight another, this time on American soil. She moved to the security monitors, watching as Nakamura and Woodward approached the 4 men with the casual confidence of locals greeting lost travelers. No weapons visible, no obvious tension, just 2 older men investigating unexpected visitors. There was no audio, but Sarah could read the interaction well enough. Credentials being shown, questions about a lost hiker, Woodward pointing vaguely toward the hills behind the cabin, Nakamura offering what appeared to be a local map. For a moment, it seemed the deception might work. Then, one of the men pointed directly at the cabin, his stance shifting subtly from conversational to confrontational. Another spoke into a radio, his eyes never leaving Nakamura. The atmosphere changed in an instant, potential energy converting to kinetic with terrible efficiency. The first man reached inside his jacket. Nakamura moved faster than seemed possible for his age, his hand closing around the man's wrist, while his other hand delivered a precise strike to the throat. Beside him, Woodward had already drawn his weapon, but not quickly enough. One of the other men tackled him to the ground while another drew a pistol equipped with a suppressor. Sarah watched in horror as the muzzle flash bloomed on the monitor. Woodward's body went limp. Nakamura was still fighting his Krav Maga training evident in every economical movement, but he was outnumbered and outgunned. She had seconds to make a decision. The tunnel would provide escape, but at the cost of leaving Nakamura to die, just as her father had died alone, fighting a battle too large for one man. Sarah Mitchell, who had spent 3 years documenting injustice at Westbrook Academy, made the only choice that honored everything she'd been taught. She grabbed the satellite phone and her laptop and moved toward the tunnel entrance. Not to escape, but to survive. Not to abandon the fight, but to ensure it continued. As she entered the narrow passage, she heard the cabin door burst open behind her. She didn't look back. Looking back was for people who had the luxury of doubt, and Sarah Mitchell had left doubt behind the moment she'd seen Woodward fall. The tunnel emerged in a small equipment shed 100 yards from the cabin. From there, Sarah could see the clearing where the confrontation had taken place. Nakamura was on his knees now, hands zip-tied behind his back, face bloody, but expression defiant, as one of the men questioned him. Sarah dialed the emergency contact, her voice steady as she relayed the location and the code phrase. Then she moved deeper into the forest using every technique Master Nakamura had taught her about evading pursuit. The sounds of a helicopter reached her 20 minutes later, the distinctive thrum of military rotors approaching from the east. By then, Sarah had put nearly a mile between herself and the cabin, using a small stream to mask her trail, just as her father had taught her during childhood camping trips. She found high ground that offered a view of the clearing, using the camera on her phone to zoom in on the unfolding scene. The helicopter was unmarked, but the men who emerged from it moved with unmistakable military discipline. Not contractors, this time. Actual special forces operators, their weapons and tactics, a clear statement of federal authority. The Reynolds security team was quickly overwhelmed, disarmed, and secured. Medics attended to Nakamura, who appeared to be conscious and alert despite his injuries. Other operators entered the cabin, emerging minutes later with equipment and files. Sarah watched it all with the detached clarity of someone who had crossed an invisible boundary, no longer a high school student with extraordinary training, but a soldier in a war that had begun before she was born. Her phone buzzed with an incoming text from an unknown number. Position confirmed. Stay in place. Extraction team en route. She settled against a tree trunk, her father's field jacket pulled tight against the growing chill. The mission had changed, but the essential truth remained the same. This was about justice, not just for her father, but for every victim of Firebase Lonesome and its terrible legacy. As the light faded from the forest, Sarah Mitchell prepared for the next phase of a battle that had been raging for 50 years. Her father had carried it as far as he could. Now it was her turn to bear witness, to document, to expose. Eagles soared, but they also watched, and sometimes they struck. Matthew Carter sat alone in his dormitory room, scrolling through news reports on his laptop. The story was everywhere now, fragmentary details about Vietnam War experiments, pharmaceutical testing, and congressional oversight failures. Senator Reynolds's name featured prominently alongside mentions of ongoing investigations into research facilities with military contracts. No mention of Sarah Mitchell or Westbrook Academy. Not yet. But Matthew knew it was coming. The truth had a momentum of its own once released into the world. His phone chimed with a secure message notification, an app he didn't remember installing, opening to reveal a single line of text. Your father was at Firebase Lonesome. So were you in your DNA. Tomorrow's news will change everything you thought you knew about yourself. You're not broken. You were designed. Attached was a medical file with his father's name and service number detailing treatment protocols and genetic expression monitoring. Matthew stared at the screen pieces of his life, rearranging themselves into a new pattern. His father's rages, his own struggles with impulse control, the special vitamins he'd taken throughout childhood. He wasn't just the son of a Vietnam veteran with PTSD. He was the inheritor of something far more deliberate and sinister: genetic modifications designed to create more effective soldiers passed down to a generation that never consented to the experiment. As Matthew absorbed this revelation, another message appeared. Others at Westbrook are like you. Tomorrow, they'll need someone who understands. Will you be that person? The question hung on the screen, a challenge and an opportunity. Matthew thought of Sarah Mitchell, who had documented abuses for 3 years while waiting for the right moment to act. He thought of his own complicity, his silence in the face of injustice. "Yes," he typed back. "Tell me what to do." The response came immediately. "Be at the main auditorium at 9 a.m. The story breaks nationwide at 9:15. Watch for Professor Collins." Tomorrow, Matthew realized everything would change not just for him, but for every student and family connected to Firebase Lonesome. The careful hierarchies of Westbrook Academy would collapse under the weight of historical truth. And he who had been part of the problem for so long now had the chance to be part of something different, something better. Outside his window, the manicured grounds of Westbrook Academy lay serene under moonlight, its Revolutionary War monuments and colonial architecture projecting an image of stability and tradition. By this time tomorrow, that image would be shattered, replaced by the uncomfortable reality that America's elite institutions had been complicit in decades of experimentation on its own soldiers and their descendants. Matthew thought of Jason Reynolds sent away to Switzerland to protect the family name. Had Jason known what his bloodline carried? Had the Reynolds family been monitoring their own genetic legacy through Jason's character-building exercises? The questions multiplied, but one certainty remained. Sarah Mitchell had known. Somehow she had discovered the truth that connected Vietnam-era war crimes to present-day Westbrook Academy. And in exposing Jason Reynolds, she had pulled the first thread that would unravel an entire conspiracy. Matthew closed his laptop, his decision made. Tomorrow he would stand with Sarah, or at least with her mission as the truth about Firebase Lonesome finally emerged from 50 years of shadow. The war that had begun in Vietnamese jungles was about to reach its final battlefield, the American conscience. Dawn found Sarah Mitchell in a secure government facility outside Boston, surrounded by federal agents and military personnel. She had spent the night debriefing multiple agencies' FBI Department of Defense Inspector General's office, each one piecing together a different aspect of the Firebase Lonesome conspiracy. Master Nakamura sat beside her, his face bruised, but his posture still military straight. He had survived his encounter with the Reynolds security team, though Woodward had not been so fortunate. The veteran journalist had died doing what he'd always done, pursuing truth, regardless of personal risk. The story breaks nationwide in 2 hours. The FBI special agent in charge informed them. Woodward's final article supplemented with declassified documents and your father's files. Major networks, print media, online platforms, simultaneous release to prevent suppression. "And Senator Reynolds?" Sarah asked. "In custody since midnight, cooperating in exchange for consideration." The agent's expression suggested the cooperation had come too late to save the senator's career or freedom. "His testimony confirms everything in your father's files and more." What about the students at Westbrook? Sarah's concern wasn't for the institution, but for the young people caught in its web. The descendants of Firebase Lonesome test subjects who would soon learn disturbing truths about their heritage. Professor Collins is coordinating with school counselors and military family support services, Nakamura answered. Matthew Carter has stepped up to help. Apparently, your example made quite an impression. Sarah thought of Matthew, conflicted, complicit, but ultimately choosing conscience when it mattered most. Perhaps that was the most anyone could ask of someone fighting against genetic programming they didn't even know they carried. What happens now? She asked the question, encompassing far more than the immediate future. Justice, hopefully, the agent replied. Prosecutions for those still living who authorized the program. Medical support for veterans and families affected by the experiments. A full accounting of the research and its applications. And reparations, Nakamura added firmly. Financial compensation can't undo 50 years of suffering, but it acknowledges responsibility. Sarah nodded, thinking of her mother working endless shifts at the VA hospital of families like Matthew's, struggling with inherited trauma they couldn't name, of an entire generation shaped by experiments they never consented to. My father would have wanted that, she said quietly. Justice, not just exposure. As the meeting concluded, Sarah was escorted to a private room where her mother waited, her face pale but composed. Marie Mitchell had been brought to the facility overnight for her protection, briefed on the situation in careful stages to prevent overwhelming her with her husband's secret life. All these years, Marie said as Sarah entered, I thought your father died in a training accident. I never imagined. He was protecting us, Sarah replied, embracing her mother, making sure his work would continue even if he couldn't. Through you, Marie touched her daughter's face gently. He always said you had his eyes and his stubborn sense of justice. And your patience, Sarah added with a small smile. As they talked, Sarah's phone buzzed with a notification. The first headlines were appearing online ahead of the coordinated release. Vietnam War experiments continued for decades on American soil. Firebase Lonesome, America's hidden shame. Senator Reynolds arrested in connection with decades-long cover-up. The truth was emerging into daylight after 50 years of shadow, not through dramatic confrontation or violent revolution, but through the patient documentation of evidence. Through waiting for the right moment. Through the quiet courage of a girl who had learned to watch and record before acting. Sarah Mitchell, daughter of a fallen soldier student, of a Vietnam veteran inheritor of a mission spanning decades, allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. The battle wasn't over. Institutional corruption never died easily, but the first victory had been secured. Justice needed evidence. Her father had taught her that through his example. Master Nakamura had reinforced it through years of training, and Sarah had honored them both by finishing what they started, exposing corruption that had festered for generations. As the news spread across the country, reaching veterans' hospitals and military bases, prestigious universities and government offices, Sarah thought of all the people who would finally understand the burdens they had carried. The children of Firebase Lonesome soldiers, the families of victims, the whistleblowers who had been silenced. The quiet observer had found her voice, and America would never be the same. The morning sun cast long shadows across Westbrook Academy's historic campus as students gathered in the main auditorium. Unlike the usual assemblies with their prescribed formality, this gathering had the electric tension of uncertainty. Rumors had been circulating since dawn, federal agents on campus emergency board meetings, faculty members being questioned. At precisely 9:00 a.m., Professor Collins stepped to the podium, her usual composure visibly strained. Behind her stood Matthew Carter, his face pale but determined, and Headmaster Sullivan looking like a man facing his own execution. Students of Westbrook Academy, Professor Collins began, her voice carrying through the hushed space. Today, information will become public that affects many of you personally. Information about a military research program called Firebase Lonesome and its connection to this school. A murmur rippled through the assembly as students exchanged confused glances. Some of you, she continued, come from families with military backgrounds. Some of you have parents or grandparents who served in Vietnam. What you don't know, what none of you could know, is that certain veterans were subjected to unauthorized medical experiments during that conflict. Experiments that had genetic consequences that have been passed down to their children. The murmur grew louder, confusion turning to alarm. For nearly 50 years, Westbrook Academy has served as more than an educational institution. It has been part of a monitoring program tracking the development of veterans' children, specifically children whose parents were stationed at a classified location called Firebase Lonesome. On cue, large screens throughout the auditorium activated displaying news feeds from major networks. Headlines scrolled across the bottom. Breaking Firebase Lonesome Conspiracy Exposed. Decades of illegal human experimentation revealed. Senator Reynolds arrested in connection with Vietnam-era war crimes. Professor Collins continued speaking, but many students were already on their phones finding their family names in the breaking news reports, discovering connections to a war that had supposedly ended before they were born. Matthew Carter stepped forward, his voice steadier than anyone expected. "I learned last night that my father was one of those soldiers," he said, looking out at his fellow students. "That the mood issues and temperament challenges I've dealt with my whole life weren't random. They were designed, part of an experiment that started in the jungles of Vietnam and continued in places like Westbrook." The auditorium had gone deathly quiet, hundreds of privileged teenagers confronting a reality no SAT prep course had prepared them for. "Many of you are about to discover similar truths about your families," Matthew continued. "It's going to be confusing, infuriating, and scary. But you're not alone. Support services are being established, and I'll be working with them to make sure everyone gets the help they need." He paused, scanning the sea of shocked faces before finding the courage to say what needed to be said. "And we all owe a debt to Sarah Mitchell, the scholarship student many of us ignored or worse, harassed. While we were enforcing social hierarchies, she was documenting a conspiracy that has affected thousands of families. Without her courage, this truth would have remained buried." As if summoned by her name, the auditorium doors opened and Sarah Mitchell entered, flanked by federal agents and Master Nakamura. She walked down the center aisle, no longer invisible, no longer silent. Her presence commanding attention without seeking it. Headmaster Sullivan stepped to the microphone, his distinguished bearing crumbling under the weight of exposed truth. "Miss Mitchell," he began, then faltered, "Sarah, I want to publicly acknowledge that you have done what I failed to do for nearly 3 decades. You exposed injustice at great personal risk. For that, and for my role in this unconscionable program, I offer my immediate resignation and my sincere apology." Sarah had not expected this surrender from the man who had tacitly permitted her harassment for 3 years. She nodded once, accepting the gesture without offering absolution. Some debts couldn't be repaid with words alone. As she took the podium, Sarah felt the weight of hundreds of eyes upon her students and faculty, trying to reconcile the quiet scholarship girl with the catalyst who had just brought down a senator, a headmaster, and an entire institutional conspiracy. "What you're learning today will change how you understand yourselves and your families," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I know because it changed how I understand mine. My father died investigating Firebase Lonesome. He gave his life trying to expose the truth about what happened there, about how it continued to affect veterans and their children." She gestured to the screens displaying continuous news coverage where photographs of Firebase Lonesome veterans, including her father and Matthew's, were being shown. These men didn't choose to be experiments. Their children, many of you, didn't choose to inherit the consequences. But now that we know the truth, we can choose what happens next. We can choose justice, healing, and accountability. As she spoke, Sarah noticed movement at the auditorium's entrance. Her mother had arrived, still wearing her VA hospital scrubs, her eyes red from a night of revelations about her husband's classified work and death. "This isn't about revenge," Sarah continued, finding strength in her mother's presence. "It's about honoring those who suffered in silence. It's about making sure no future generation carries burdens they didn't consent to bear." After the assembly, Westbrook Academy descended into controlled chaos. Parents arrived in waves demanding answers, seeking reassurance, confronting life-altering revelations about their families. News helicopters circled overhead. Federal agents conducted interviews in administrative offices. Military medical personnel established a temporary processing center in the gymnasium. Sarah found her mother waiting in the courtyard, the spring sunlight incongruously bright against the darkness of the day's revelations. "I never knew," Marie Mitchell said as they embraced. "James told me his work was classified, but I never imagined." She trailed off, struggling to reconcile the husband she'd known with the crusading investigator who had died pursuing justice. "He couldn't tell you," Sarah said gently. "He was protecting us both. And you've been carrying this burden alone." Her mother's voice broke. "Training with Master Nakamura, documenting everything, preparing to finish what your father started. You're 17, Sarah. You should be worried about college applications, not government conspiracies." Sarah smiled faintly. "I am worried about college applications. Harvard might reconsider after I helped put one of their biggest donors in federal custody." The attempt at humor fell flat against the magnitude of the situation, but it accomplished what Sarah intended, a momentary lightening of her mother's anguish. "What happens now?" Marie asked the question containing multitudes. Before Sarah could answer, Master Nakamura approached, accompanied by a distinguished-looking man in an army dress uniform, a full colonel with combat decorations, and the bearing of someone accustomed to command. "Mrs. Mitchell, Sarah," Nakamura said formally. "This is Colonel Thomas Reeves, Special Inspector for the Department of Defense. He's overseeing the Firebase Lonesome investigation." Colonel Reeves extended his hand. "Mrs. Mitchell, I served with your husband in Special Forces before he transferred to intelligence. He was a good man, one of the best I've known." Marie accepted the handshake automatically, years of military spouse conditioning kicking in despite her emotional turmoil. "You knew James. I was with him at Firebase Lonesome in '71, Reeves confirmed. "One of the few who wasn't part of the experimental program. Your husband saved my life during an enemy attack, then spent decades trying to save everyone else affected by what happened there." Sarah studied the colonel carefully, noting the genuine respect in his voice when he spoke of her father. "Are you here to contain the situation, sir?" Reeves met her gaze with equal assessment. "I'm here to ensure justice is served, Miss Mitchell. Your father's work deserves nothing less." Master Nakamura nodded slightly, signaling to Sarah that Reeves could be trusted, at least provisionally. "There will be congressional hearings," Reeves continued, "criminal prosecutions, medical support programs for affected veterans and their families. The full weight of government machinery is now focused on Firebase Lonesome, something your father worked toward for years." "And Senator Reynolds?" Sarah asked, "negotiating a plea deal in exchange for naming every official involved in the cover-up." Reeves's expression was grim satisfaction. "The dominoes are falling, and they lead to some very powerful people." As they spoke, Matthew approached hesitantly, his customary confidence replaced by respectful uncertainty. "Sarah, there's something you should know," he said, nodding deferentially to the adults. "Jason Reynolds is back. His parents brought him home from Switzerland when the news broke. He's asking to see you." Sarah felt a complex surge of emotions: anger, curiosity, wariness. Jason Reynolds had been her tormentor for 3 years, the entitled bully who had pushed her to defend herself and inadvertently triggered the exposure of Firebase Lonesome. "Where is he?" she asked. "Federal custody," Matthew replied. "They're holding him as a material witness at the field office downtown. Apparently, he has information about his father's private records, things even the senator didn't disclose." Sarah looked to Nakamura, who had been her guide through this entire ordeal. His expression revealed nothing, but his slight nod told her everything she needed to know. The mission wasn't complete. There were still threads to follow, still truths to uncover. "I'll see him," she decided, but not alone. 4 hours later, Sarah sat across from Jason Reynolds in a sterile federal interview room. Gone was the arrogant quarterback in designer clothes. In his place sat a hollow-eyed young man in a plain gray sweatshirt, his right wrist still in a cast from their confrontation. Master Nakamura stood silent in the corner while Colonel Reeves and a federal prosecutor observed from behind one-way glass. "Thank you for coming," Jason began, his voice lacking its usual commanding tone. "I know you have no reason to help me." "I'm not here to help you," Sarah replied evenly. "I'm here for the truth, about Firebase Lonesome, about what your father kept hidden all these years." Jason nodded, accepting her terms. "My father has a secure room in our house, his war room, he calls it. After they arrested him, I broke in. Found things I think people should know about." He slid a manila envelope across the table. Sarah opened it carefully, finding photographs of documents, maps, and what appeared to be medical records. "These are names," she said, scanning the lists. "Hundreds of names." "Test subjects," Jason confirmed. "Not just from Vietnam, Bosnia, Afghanistan, Iraq. The program never stopped. It just moved and evolved." Sarah looked up sharply. "Your father continued the experiments after Vietnam in other conflicts. Different drugs, different objectives, but same basic idea, creating better soldiers through pharmaceutical enhancement." Jason's voice was flat, devoid of emotion. "And tracking their children to study genetic effects." Sarah thought of her father's files, which had focused primarily on Vietnam-era experiments. If Jason was telling the truth, the conspiracy was exponentially larger and more current than anyone had realized. "Why are you showing me this?" she asked. "Why not give it directly to federal investigators?" Jason met her eyes directly for the first time. "Because I don't trust them. My father had connections everywhere, military, government, pharmaceutical companies. I needed to give this to someone who couldn't be bought or threatened." The implicit acknowledgement that Sarah Mitchell was beyond corruption hung between them a strange reconciliation between former adversaries. "There's something else," Jason continued, his voice dropping lower. "Something about your father." Sarah felt her breath catch. "What about him?" "He wasn't killed in a training accident. My father had him eliminated when he got too close to exposing the program. It's all documented in the files, dates, personnel, method." The clinical description of her father's murder landed like a physical blow, confirming what Sarah had suspected but had never been able to prove. "Did you know?" she asked, her voice steady, despite the storm inside her. "When you were harassing me at school, did you know who my father was? What your father had done to him?" "No," Jason replied, and Sarah believed him. "I didn't know anything until the night they sent me to Switzerland. My father was drunk ranting about how history was repeating itself, how Mitchell's daughter was going to destroy everything, just like her father almost did." Sarah absorbed this, fitting it into the larger picture. Jason Reynolds, for all his cruelty, had been as much a pawn as anyone, the son of a man twisted by guilt and pharmaceutical enhancement, raised to continue a legacy of power built on suffering. "There's one more thing you should know," Jason said, his voice catching. "I was part of it too. The experiments. My father enrolled me in what he called specialized pharmaceutical therapy when I was 12. Said it would help me excel in sports academics leadership. He pushed up his sleeve, revealing track marks that had nothing to do with recreational drug use. Twice weekly injections, performance enhancers based on the Firebase lonesome formulas, but refined for civilian application. That's what the doctors called it. Hera stared at the evidence of Jason's unwitting participation in his father's continuing experiments. The rage issues, the volatility, the physical aggression, all chemically induced and enhanced, then shaped through the senator's brutal character building. "Does the FBI know about this?" she asked. "I told them yesterday. They've ordered comprehensive blood work, genetic testing." Jason's laugh was brittle. "Turns out I'm as much a lab rat as anyone at Firebase Lonesome, just a more expensive one." The revelation reframed everything Sarah had experienced at Westbrook. Jason Reynolds wasn't just a privileged bully, he was a victim of his father's obsession, a test subject in an ongoing experiment that had begun in Vietnam jungles 50 years earlier. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," Jason said correctly, reading her expression. "What I did to you and others was wrong, regardless of what was done to me. I just thought you deserved to know the full truth." Hera nodded, accepting his statement without offering absolution. Some journeys couldn't be walked for others. She gathered the documents, preparing to leave when Jason spoke once more. "Your father was a hero," he said quietly. "Even my father admitted that in his private files. He called James Mitchell the conscience we silenced but couldn't escape." Sarah paused at the door, not turning back. "And what does that make you, Jason?" "I don't know yet," he replied honestly. "But I'm trying to figure it out." The congressional hearings began 6 weeks later, held in the ornate chambers where America's most consequential decisions were debated and determined. Sarah Mitchell testified on the third day, her composed recounting of 3 years' documentation at Westbrook Academy, providing the human context for the technical evidence being presented by military and medical experts. "Miss Mitchell," the committee chairwoman asked, "when did you first suspect there might be a connection between student behavior at Westbrook Academy and historical events at Firebase Lonesome?" "I didn't make that connection initially," Sarah replied, aware of the cameras broadcasting her testimony nationwide. "I was simply documenting patterns of harassment and administrative indifference. It was Master Nakamura who helped me understand the larger context." "And that would be Robert Nakamura, former FBI special agent and Vietnam veteran." "Yes, ma'am. He served with my father in Vietnam, then continued working with him during the Firebase Lonesome investigation." "Were you aware of the risks you were taking by pursuing this documentation?" Sarah thought of the 3 years spent in calculated invisibility, of the confrontation with Jason Reynolds, of the attack on the cabin that had cost Carl Woodward his life. "I understood there were risks," she answered carefully, "but I believed then, as I believe now, that silence in the face of injustice only perpetuates suffering." In the gallery behind her, Marie Mitchell wiped away tears, pride, and grief, intermingled as she watched her daughter complete the mission that had cost her husband his life. Beside Marie sat Matthew Carter, attending the hearings with his father, Colonel Carter, now receiving treatment for the chemical and genetic alterations he'd unknowingly carried since Vietnam. The treatments were helping, gradually reducing the rage issues and paranoia that had shadowed their family for decades. Master Nakamura observed from further back, his stoic expression revealing nothing to casual observers. But Sarah, who had trained with him for 6 years, could read the subtle signs of satisfaction in his posture. The mission he had begun with James Mitchell was reaching its conclusion, justice finally emerging from decades of shadow. When the day's testimony concluded, Sarah found Colonel Reeves waiting in the hallway outside the chamber. "Well done, Miss Mitchell," he said with professional approval. "Your testimony connected the technical evidence to human experience in a way that can't be ignored or dismissed." "What happens next?" Sarah asked the question that had become her standard response to each new development. "Indictments," Reeves replied. "Dozens of them reaching into pharmaceutical companies, defense contractors, military leadership, and multiple congressional committees. The Firebase lonesome conspiracy was vast and multi-generational. And the victims, the veterans and their families, that's the next phase," Reeves confirmed. "A comprehensive support program is being established. Medical treatment, genetic counseling, financial compensation. Your input on the program design has been invaluable." Sarah nodded, thinking of the hours she'd spent reviewing proposals, ensuring that the government's response addressed not just physical consequences, but psychological damage as well. "There's something else you should know," Reeves continued, lowering his voice. "Your father's service record has been amended. The false training accident report has been expunged, replaced with an accurate account of his counterintelligence work and the circumstances of his death." He handed her a small velvet box. Inside was the Silver Star, one of America's highest military decorations awarded for gallantry in action. "This would have been presented years ago if the truth hadn't been buried," Reeves said solemnly. "Your father's sacrifice likely saved hundreds of lives by preventing Firebase lonesome techniques from being deployed in subsequent conflicts." Sarah stared at the medal, its silver surface catching the light from the historic corridor's chandeliers. This small piece of metal couldn't bring her father back, couldn't restore the 7 years she'd spent believing he died in a meaningless accident. But it represented something profound, official acknowledgement of the truth, the government's formal recognition that James Mitchell had died serving his country with honor. "Thank you," she said, simply closing the box and placing it carefully in her bag. As she walked through the Capitol's marble corridors, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her here. 3 years ago, she had been a scholarship student trying to survive Westbrook Academy's hostile environment. Now, she was a key witness in congressional hearings that would reshape military medical ethics and veterans' care for generations. Outside, spring had fully arrived in Washington, cherry blossoms drifting across the mall like pink snow. Sarah found Master Nakamura waiting on the Capitol steps, his weathered face turned toward the Washington Monument standing stark against the blue sky. "Your testimony was excellent," he said without preamble, "precise, factual, compelling. Your father would have been proud." "Colonel Reeves gave me his Silver Star," Sarah replied, matching Nakamura's directness. Nakamura nodded approvingly. "Long overdue recognition." They walked in comfortable silence toward the reflecting pool, two warriors at different stages of the same long battle. "I've been offered a position," Sarah said eventually, "special advisor to the Firebase Lonesome Reconciliation Committee. They want me to help design support programs for affected families. Will you accept?" "I'm considering it." She hesitated. "It would mean deferring college for a year." Nakamura smiled slightly. "Harvard has stood for nearly 400 years. It can wait 1 more year for Sarah Mitchell." Sarah returned the smile, acknowledging the decision she had already made, but needed to hear validated. The Firebase Lonesome mission wasn't complete yet. There were still families who needed help, still systems that required reform, still truths that demanded documentation. "What about you?" she asked. "Will you continue your FBI consulting work?" "I've been asked to help train the support team for Firebase lonesome families," Nakamura replied. "Many of the veterans and their children have experienced undiagnosed medical issues for decades. They need more than conventional therapy." Sarah understood immediately. Nakamura would teach them what he had taught her, how to channel fear into focus, how to transform helplessness into agency, how to document injustice as a path to healing. "We've won the first battle," Nakamura continued. "But the war for accountability continues. Pharmaceutical companies are already deploying lawyers to limit damages. Military officials are claiming national security privilege to avoid testimony. Politicians are distancing themselves from decisions they personally approved." "So nothing really changes," Sarah said, momentary discouragement clouding her voice. "Everything changes," Nakamura corrected firmly. "Because now the truth is known. What was hidden has been revealed. And once revealed, truth cannot be unrevealed. That is your father's legacy, and now yours." They reached the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, its black granite surface reflecting the faces of visitors who had come to honor the fallen. Sarah had visited this wall many times since moving to Washington for the hearings, her fingers tracing names of men who had served at Firebase, lonesome men whose suffering had continued long after they returned home. Today, a new addition had been installed, a temporary exhibition about Firebase Lonesome, including photographs of the secret facility and the men who had been stationed there. Among them was a picture of James Mitchell, standing beside a younger Robert Nakamura, both men in jungle fatigues, their expressions serious but determined. Visitors clustered around the exhibition, some taking photos, others reading the information panels with solemn attention. Among them, Sarah recognized families she had met during the hearings, children and grandchildren of Firebase lonesome veterans seeking understanding of inherited traumas they were only now beginning to comprehend. "Your documentation made this possible," Nakamura said quietly. "Without evidence, there is no justice. Without justice, there is no healing." Sarah watched as an elderly veteran in a wheelchair approached the exhibition, accompanied by a middle-aged man who was clearly his son. The family resemblance was striking, as was the identical set of their shoulders, a physical manifestation of tension carried across generations. The son helped position his father directly in front of James Mitchell's photograph. The old soldier stared at the image for a long moment, then raised his hand in a shaking salute. "He was there," Nakamura murmured. "Firebase Lonesome 1971, one of the test subjects in the first experimental group." Sarah moved toward them, drawn by an instinct she couldn't quite name. The elderly veteran lowered his salute as she approached his weathered face, turning toward her with the careful movement of someone managing chronic pain. "You're Mitchell's daughter," he said, his voice gravelly with age and emotion. "I saw your testimony this morning." "Yes, sir," Sarah confirmed. "I'm Sarah Mitchell." "Frank Dawson," the veteran replied. "Your father saved my life twice, once in Vietnam, and again through what you've done here. The doctors finally know what's wrong with me. What's wrong with my son and grandkids, too. After 50 years of being told, it was all in my head." His son extended his hand. "Michael Dawson. My father's been having unexplained neurological symptoms since before I was born. Now we know they're connected to the Firebase Lonesome experiments. Because of your work, we're finally getting proper treatment." Sarah shook his hand, overwhelmed by the direct connection to her father's work. These weren't abstract victims in medical files. They were real people whose lives had been irrevocably altered by Firebase Lonesome, and who were now finding answers because of documentation that had spanned generations. "Your father kept records, too," Frank Dawson continued, patting a worn leather satchel attached to his wheelchair. "Names, dates, symptoms. 50 years' worth. Figured someday someone would need to know what happened to us." Sarah stared at the satchel, understanding its significance immediately. "You documented everything." The old soldier nodded, a hint of pride breaking through his stoic expression. Didn't know what I was documenting exactly. Just knew something wasn't right. Figured the truth would matter someday. It matters now, Sarah assured him. Every piece of evidence helps build the case for comprehensive support and accountability. As they talked, more veterans and families approached, drawn by Frank Dawson's presence. Soon, a small crowd had gathered around Sarah and Master Nakamura, people sharing stories of mysterious symptoms, of medical dismissals, of generational struggles that suddenly had context. One woman, approximately Sarah's mother's age, pressed a photograph into her hands. "My father served with yours," she explained. "He never talked about Vietnam, but he kept this picture until the day he died." The photograph showed a group of young soldiers outside a jungle outpost. Sarah recognized her father immediately, standing beside a man who resembled the woman who had given her the picture. "He wrote something on the back," the woman added. Sarah turned the photograph over, finding a faded inscription in her father's handwriting: "Firebase Lonesome, 1972. The truth will survive us." The simple statement, written decades before Sarah was born, struck her with unexpected force. Her father had known even then that the fight for justice would outlast him, that the documentation he began might need to be completed by others. By her. Master Nakamura placed a steadying hand on her shoulder, recognizing the emotional impact of this direct connection to her father's mission. "Your father planted seeds of truth," he said quietly. "You've helped them grow into justice." As the impromptu gathering continued, Sarah noticed a familiar figure observing from a respectful distance Matthew Carter standing beside his father. Both men looked different from when she had first encountered them at Westbrook Academy. The aggressive entitlement was gone, replaced by a more grounded presence. Sarah motioned them over, including them in the growing circle of Firebase Lonesome families. "Colonel Carter has been helping organize the Veterans Support Network," she explained to the group. "And Matthew has been working with the Children and Grandchildren program." Matthew nodded, his expression earnest. "We're creating peer support groups for kids like us, people who inherited effects we never understood until now. It's helping a lot of us process what's happening." Colonel Carter, now receiving treatment for the chemical alterations that had affected his behavior for decades, spoke with the direct clarity of a military man. What happened at Firebase Lonesome was a betrayal of everything the uniform stands for. But what's happening now, the truth, the accountability, the support that represents the best of American values. We acknowledge our failures and work to make them right. The gathering had taken on the quality of a reunion, veterans and families sharing experiences that had previously been isolated struggles. Sarah moved among them, listening more than speaking, documenting in her mind the human impact of her father's work and her own. As evening approached, the group gradually dispersed, many heading to a nearby restaurant to continue their conversations. Sarah declined the invitation to join them, needing time to process the emotional weight of the day. She found herself alone at the Vietnam Memorial as twilight descended the black granite, reflecting the first stars appearing in the deepening blue sky. Running her fingers along the engraved names Sarah thought of, all the men who had returned from that conflict carrying burdens they couldn't name or understand, chemical alterations, pharmaceutical dependencies, genetic modifications that would affect generations to come. "I thought I might find you here." The voice startled her. Sarah turned to find Jason Reynolds standing a respectful distance away, his right hand still in a lighter cast than when she had last seen him. He looked different, the entitled arrogance replaced by a more subdued presence. "The committee announced my father's plea deal today," Jason said when Sarah didn't immediately respond. 20 years in federal prison in exchange for complete disclosure about Firebase Lonesome and subsequent programs. I heard, Sarah replied neutrally. They're calling it the most significant military conspiracy case since Iran-Contra. Jason nodded, accepting her measured response. I've been working with the prosecutors, helping them understand my father's files. It's the least I can do. And your mother. Cooperating too, though she claims she knew nothing about Firebase Lonesome. Jason's expression suggested he didn't entirely believe this. She's agreed to establish a foundation for affected families, using the Reynolds family fortune to help the people they harmed. Sarah studied him carefully, looking for signs of the boy who had tormented her for 3 years. That Jason seemed to have vanished, replaced by someone more uncertain, but perhaps more authentic. The doctors have me on a detox protocol, Jason continued, correctly reading her assessment. Clearing the performance enhancers from my system. They say it will take months, maybe years, to fully reverse the effects. And then what? Sarah asked. Then I try to figure out who I really am without the chemicals and my father's character building. Jason's attempt at a smile didn't quite reach his eyes. The prosecutors are recommending against criminal charges for me, given my age when the injection started and my cooperation now. But I'll be testifying in most of the civil cases. Sarah considered this information the complicated reality of Jason as both perpetrator and victim. Why are you telling me this? Because I owe you the truth, he replied simply, and because I want you to know that what you've done, exposing Firebase Lonesome, finishing your father's work, it matters. It's saving lives, including mine. The admission hung between them neither apology nor plea for forgiveness, but something more fundamental: acknowledgement of truth and its power to heal. I can't change what I did at Westbrook, Jason continued, but I'm trying to make better choices now. That's something I learned from you, actually. We always have choices, even when the system is designed to deny them. Sarah thought of her 3 years documenting abuse at Westbrook Academy, of her father's decades-long investigation of Firebase Lonesome, of Master Nakamura's patient mentorship. Documentation is the first step, she said finally, but it's meaningless without action. I know. Jason glanced at the Vietnam Memorial, its polished surface reflecting their images like shadows against the engraved names. That's why I've decided to testify publicly about the psychological conditioning methods my father used. The prosecutors say it will help establish pattern and intent for the larger conspiracy case. Sarah nodded, respecting his decision while maintaining emotional distance. Some bridges couldn't be rebuilt once burned. Some wounds left permanent scars even after healing. Good luck with your testimony, she said, preparing to leave. Sarah, Jason called as she turned away. One more thing you should know. Your father, they're adding his name to the Intelligence Community Memorial Wall for operatives who died in the line of duty. The ceremony is next week. The news stopped her. The Intelligence Community Memorial Wall was a sacred space within the CIA headquarters, honoring those who had made the ultimate sacrifice in America's clandestine services. Having James Mitchell's name added, there represented the final official acknowledgement of his true service and sacrifice. Thank you for telling me, Sarah said, meaning it. As she walked away from the Vietnam Memorial, leaving Jason Reynolds, contemplating the names of men who had served during his father's war, Sarah felt a sense of completion settling over her. Not closure, the Firebase. Lonesome's story was far from finished, but recognition that a significant chapter had concluded. Her father's mission had been acknowledged. The truth he died protecting was now public record. Justice, while imperfect, was being pursued through congressional hearings, criminal prosecutions, and support programs for affected families. And Sarah Mitchell who had entered Westbrook Academy as a scholarship student trying to remain invisible, had found her voice and her purpose in completing her father's work. The Intelligence Community Memorial Ceremony was held on a perfect spring morning, the CIA headquarters compound in Langley, Virginia, showcasing its manicured grounds and imposing architecture. Sarah and her mother were escorted through security with deferential respect, their status as family of the honored fallen opening doors that normally remained firmly closed to civilians. Master Nakamura accompanied them, his visitor badge identifying him as a former FBI special agent and Vietnam veteran. His presence steadied Sarah as they were led through corridors of power few Americans ever witnessed. The memorial wall itself occupied a solemn space in the headquarters lobby, a field of stars carved into white marble, each representing an officer who had died in service. Names were listed in the Book of Honor, displayed before the wall, though some remained anonymous due to ongoing operational security. James Mitchell's name would be among those fully acknowledged his status as an intelligence operative investigating domestic corruption, no longer requiring concealment. The ceremony was brief, but powerful intelligence community leadership and military representatives paying tribute to officers whose additions to the wall had been delayed by classified circumstances. James Mitchell was one of 5 names being added that day, each representing a sacrifice that had remained unacknowledged for years or decades. When it was her father's turn, Sarah stepped forward with her mother to receive the memorial star, a crystal representation of the star that would forever mark James Mitchell's service on the marble wall. Major James Mitchell's investigation of Project Firebase Lonesome represented the highest ideals of intelligence service, the CIA director stated. He identified a domestic conspiracy that threatened national security and ethical military conduct, pursuing that investigation at great personal risk. His ultimate sacrifice has led to accountability and justice that will benefit generations of veterans and their families. As Sarah accepted the memorial star, she caught sight of Colonel Reeves standing at attention among the military representatives. Beside him was another familiar face, Frank Dawson, the Firebase Lonesome veteran she had met at the Vietnam Memorial, now in his dress uniform despite his wheelchair. Both men saluted as James Mitchell's star was unveiled on the wall, a gesture of profound respect from warriors who understood the true meaning of service and sacrifice. After the ceremony, Sarah found a moment alone with the memorial wall, studying the field of stars, representing lives given in silent service. Her father's star was now among them, one point of light in a constellation of sacrifice. "He would be proud of you," Master Nakamura said, joining her quiet contemplation, "not just for exposing Firebase Lonesome, but for how you did it with precision documentation and strategic patience." "I had a good teacher," Sarah replied, acknowledging his role in preparing her to complete her father's mission. "You had 2 good teachers," Nakamura corrected gently. "Your father laid the foundation. I merely helped you build upon it." As they prepared to leave the CIA headquarters, Colonel Reeves approached with a formal envelope bearing government seals. "This arrived at my office this morning," he explained, handing it to Sarah. "Authorization to release the remaining classified files on Firebase Lonesome to the Congressional Committee. The full truth will finally be on the record." Sarah accepted the envelope, understanding its significance. With these files, the last barriers to complete accountability would fall. Pharmaceutical companies couldn't hide behind government secrecy. Military officials couldn't claim national security privilege. The entire conspiracy would be exposed to public scrutiny and justice. "Your father began this journey 50 years ago in the jungles of Vietnam," Reeves continued. "You've helped bring it to completion. That's a legacy few people ever achieve." As Sarah, her mother, and Master Nakamura departed the CIA compound, they found a group waiting respectfully beyond the security perimeter, Firebase lonesome families who had come to honor James Mitchell's recognition. Among them were Matthew and Colonel Carter Frank, and Michael Dawson, and other veterans and descendants Sarah had met during the congressional hearings. "They came to pay their respects," Matthew explained. "Your father is a hero to everyone affected by Firebase Lonesome." As Sarah was moved by this spontaneous gathering, this tangible evidence that her father's work and sacrifice had meaning beyond official recognition. These were the people whose lives would change because of justice, finally delivered veterans receiving proper medical treatment, children understanding the genetic factors affecting their development, families healing from trauma that had spanned generations. The group had organized an impromptu reception at a nearby Veterans Hall where photographs of James Mitchell and other Firebase lonesome whistleblowers were displayed alongside memorabilia from Vietnam. The atmosphere was solemn, but hopeful people who had carried unnamed burdens for decades finally finding community and understanding. As Sarah moved through the gathering, she was struck by how many of them had stories similar to her own children who had documented their parents' mysterious symptoms, veterans who had kept records of their experiences, families who had sensed something was wrong but couldn't identify its source. They had all been quiet observers in their own way, collecting evidence of injustice while waiting for the right moment to speak truth to power. Master Nakamura found her near a display of Firebase lonesome photographs, studying an image of the outpost where her father had first encountered the experimental program. "Your mission is complete," he said, pride evident in his usually stoic expression. "But I suspect your work is just beginning." Sarah nodded, understanding his meaning. The Firebase lonesome revelation had opened doors to other military medical ethics investigations, other veterans' justice initiatives, other accountability projects that would require the skills she had developed. "I accepted the position with the Reconciliation Committee," she told him. "Harvard has approved my deferral year." "A wise choice," Nakamura approved. Some educations can't be found in classrooms, even at Harvard. As the reception continued, Sarah stepped outside for a moment of quiet reflection. The spring evening was settling over Virginia cherry blossoms, drifting in the gentle breeze, the distant monuments of Washington gleaming in the fading light. She thought of how far she had come from the quiet scholarship girl at Westbrook Academy, documenting harassment training in secret, preparing for a confrontation she couldn't fully anticipate. That girl had been invisible by necessity, silent by strategy. The woman returning inside to join the Firebase lonesome families was different. Visible, vocal, committed to ensuring that silence never again protected injustice. Sarah Mitchell, daughter of a fallen intelligence officer, student of a Vietnam veteran, inheritor of a 50-year mission for truth, had found her voice. And America was listening. 1 year later, Sarah Mitchell stood at the podium in Westbrook Academy's main auditorium, addressing a very different institution than the one she had entered as a freshman. The student body before her represented a more diverse population. Scholarship students made up 20% of enrollment now, and a new ethical leadership curriculum had replaced the old emphasis on social hierarchies. Westbrook Academy was founded during the American Revolution. Sarah began her voice carrying confidently through the space. Its original mission was to educate citizen leaders who would build a more perfect union. Somewhere along the way, that mission became corrupted, not just by the Firebase lonesome connection, but by systems of privilege that confused wealth with worth. She gestured to the newly installed memorial wall at the side of the auditorium, where photographs and biographies of Firebase lonesome veterans created a permanent reminder of the school's complicated history. This institution is now engaged in its own revolution, reclaiming its founding purpose by acknowledging past failures and committing to ethical leadership for the future. That transformation wouldn't have been possible without truth documentation and the courage to speak when silence would have been easier. In the audience, Matthew Carter nodded his agreement. Now heading the student advocate program Sarah had helped design, Matthew had found purpose in supporting other Firebase lonesome descendants navigating their complicated genetic inheritance. Beside him sat Professor Collins, recently appointed as Westbrook's new headmaster, following Sullivan's resignation and subsequent cooperation with federal investigations. The Firebase Lonesome Reconciliation Act was signed into law last month. Sarah continued referring to the comprehensive legislation providing medical treatment research funding and financial compensation for affected veterans and families. That law represents America at its best, acknowledging mistakes, accepting responsibility, and working to repair harm across generations. She didn't mention her own role in shaping the legislation, serving as special advisor to the congressional committee that had drafted it. That work had been deeply satisfying, but intentionally behind the scenes, her father's daughter to the core. As I prepare to begin my freshman year at Harvard next fall, I carry with me the most important lesson from my time at Westbrook: documentation without action is merely observation, but documentation with strategic action can change the world. After her address, Sarah found Master Nakamura waiting in the courtyard exactly where he had trained her to meet if they were ever separated during an operation. Old habits remained, even as their mission had evolved. "Your speech was excellent," he said with characteristic economy. "Clear purpose, specific evidence, compelling conclusion." "I had a good teacher," Sarah replied, falling into step beside him as they walked the campus grounds. "Several good teachers," Nakamura corrected. "Your father, me, the veterans whose stories you've documented, the families seeking justice. You've learned from all of us." Sarah nodded, acknowledging the truth in his assessment. The past year working with the Reconciliation Committee had been an education no university could provide. Understanding complex government systems, navigating institutional resistance, translating individual suffering into effective policy. "Harvard next," she said, glancing at the acceptance letter she had received that morning. "Political science and pre-law." Nakamura's approving nod contained no surprise. They both knew this was the logical next step in her evolving mission, gaining the credentials and connections to continue fighting for accountability and justice. "Your father once told me that true patriots are those who hold America accountable to its highest ideals," Nakamura said as they reached the campus gates. "He would be proud to see you continuing that tradition." As they parted ways, Nakamura, to his ongoing work training support personnel for Firebase lonesome families, Sarah to prepare for her Harvard orientation, they exchanged the formal bow that had concluded their training sessions for 6 years. Master and student, mentor and protege. Veterans of different wars fought on the same moral terrain. Sarah Mitchell walked away from Westbrook Academy for the final time, no longer the invisible scholarship student documenting abuse in silence, but a recognized catalyst for institutional change and governmental accountability. The quiet observer had found her voice, and that voice would continue speaking truth to power for generations to come, documenting injustice, demanding accountability, honoring the fallen, and protecting the vulnerable. Eagles soared, but they also watched, and sometimes they changed the course of history with nothing more than the steady beat of their wings and the clarity of their vision. In the end, silence held power that words alone could never match. Sarah Mitchell began her journey as a ghost in Westbrook's hallowed halls, invisible by necessity, watchful by design. What started as survival became revolution, a quiet girl's documentation igniting a fire that consumed decades of corruption. victory came at tremendous cost. James Mitchell never saw his daughter complete the mission that claimed his life. Carl Woodward paid with his blood for truths he spent a lifetime pursuing. Countless veterans carried wounds no medal could honor, passing unseen scars to children who never set foot on Vietnamese soil. Yet, from these shadows emerged something profound: justice delayed, but not denied. The firebase, lonesome revelation offered healing to those who had suffered in silence for 50 years. Their unexplained symptoms finally given names, their invisible burdens finally acknowledged. Sometimes the quietest voices carry the loudest truths. Sometimes documentation becomes salvation. Sometimes it takes one person standing firm to remind a nation what honor truly means. What silent battles are you fighting? What truths are you documenting? What legacy will you leave when your own war is done?